to know why I'm in a great mood? Spring is in the air. It's almost time to break out the fishing rods, fire up the grill, fire up the lawnmower too. It's such a great time of year. Puts me in a good mood. You know what else spring is a good time for every 4 years? Political primaries. What's a political primary, you may ask? Well, let's get to it. Pretty cool new intro, huh, guys? Huh? Right? Okay, so I know it's not the best, but I was pretty impressed with myself for at least a couple minutes. I got tired of making a different intro every week, so I think I'm just going to roll with that one every week from now on. Now, last week we talked about political parties and political ideologies, but have you ever wondered how the political parties each get the candidates that they do to run for president? Have you ever wondered why everyone thinks their choices for president suck, yet we live in a democracy, so technically it's the people that chose them, but the people don't like them? So how do the political parties decide who they're going to choose to run for president? Well, it all boils down to primaries and caucuses. To explain what those are, I'll let CP Gray and all of his awesome stick figures kind of illustrate it for you.
Primary elections are how political parties in the United States pick their strongest candidate to run for president. The parties do this by holding mini-elections in each of the states, and the candidates with the most votes from these elections becomes the party's official nominees. These nominees then face each other in the national election for president. But this isn't the whole story. There are 5 things that make it a bit more complicated than that. Complication number 1, primaries versus caucuses. In every state, the local party leaders decide how to run their elections. The 2 most common choices are primaries and caucuses. Primaries are just like standard elections. Go to the polls whenever you can, stand in a long line, hide in a booth, then tick a box or press a button, and your vote is cast in complete anonymity. A caucus, however, is a public vote. People gather in groups wherever space is available, then literally take sides in a room with everyone else who likes the same candidate. The groups debate each other, and, if people change their minds, they need to physically switch sides. At the end of the debates, the party representatives count the number of people in each group. If you leave too early, your vote doesn't count. This description of primaries and caucuses is really all you need to know, but the specifics can vary wildly. That's because there are 50 states, all of which hold at least 2 primaries and caucuses for the big parties, and possibly more for the small parties. Covering all the local variants would take a tediously long time, which your short attention span for boring political videos wouldn't tolerate. And you need to stay focused because there are 4 more things to come. Complication number 2, who can vote? In the national presidential election, all American citizens over the age of 18 can vote, with 2 exceptions. You can't live here or here. But primaries are in-state elections with lots of different rules. Most states and parties will only let you vote in the primary if you're an official member of the party. This is called a closed primary because the voting is closed to non-party members. But some citizens are independents and not registered with any party. If you're an independent and live in a state with closed party elections, tough luck. No voting for you. Some states, however, have semi-closed primaries where independents can pick one and only one primary to vote in. Parties allow this because the presidential election is often determined by independents, so knowing which candidates they like is useful. Finally, a few states and parties really play it fast and loose with open primaries. Here, any citizen, no matter which party they're registered with, can pick a primary to vote in. But it's not just the states that have primaries. They're also held in the District of Columbia and the oft-forgotten territories. Holding primaries here is a bit odd though, considering that territorial residents can't vote in the actual presidential election. Lastly are the Americans living abroad who, depending on the party, vote in a block as though they all live together in one big extra state. When all these elections take place depends on complication number 3, who votes when. Primaries aren't conducted all at once but are spread out over a year. This leads to fights between the states about who gets to be at the head of the line and who is stuck at the back. Inevitably, last-minute leapfrogging of dates happens even though the parties often take away votes from these uncivil states. When it comes to being number 1, nobody beats New Hampshire, who wrote it into state law that their primary will always be at least a week ahead of everyone else's. Which isn't a problem until some other state gets the bright idea to do the same, and then we have an infinite loop in our system and have to force quit the law. But wait, you say, doesn't Iowa already go first? Yes, but New Hampshire lets them get away with it for 2 reasons. First, Iowa's election is a caucus, and so New Hampshire is still technically the first primary, and second, New Hampshire thinks that Iowa is stupid and doesn't matter. Other states try to boost their influence not by cutting in line, but by forming an alliance and holding their primaries at the same time. The biggest alliance of the election cycle is called Super Tuesday, where, depending on how many states can agree with each other, around half of them might participate, giving out a whole pile of votes. Which brings us to complication number 4, votes that aren't votes. So this whole time you were probably thinking that citizens gave votes straight to the candidates, but no. Instead, the votes are given to a bunch of guys called delegates who in turn give them to the candidates as requested. Maybe. Depending on the state, delegates might be required to vote as the citizens did, or they might be completely free to ignore the citizens and vote for whomever they want. Who are these people? The delegates are local party VIPs, such as state reps and officials. The more citizens who live in a state, the more delegates that state gets. Later in the year, when all the states have finished their primaries, the delegates travel to a huge gathering for their party called the National Convention. It's here that the official vote to select the party's nominee for president happens. But it's not just the delegates who do the voting. Complication number 5, superdelegates. Superdelegates are the top members of the party, such as congressmen and former presidents. They go to the National Convention not to represent the people, but to represent the current party establishment and can vote for whomever they want. Depending on the party, superdelegates might be up to 20% of the voters at the National Convention. Usually by the time the National Convention happens, all the candidates save one have dropped out of the race, so the convention is just a rubber stamp and a big party. But if the fight between candidates is still ongoing, the delegates and superdelegates are the ones with the final decision. In summary, over the course of a year, the states plus DC plus the territories and the Americans abroad hold their primaries or caucuses. When finished, the delegates representing the citizens who voted in those elections travel to the National Convention. Most of the delegates are forced to vote as the citizens of their state wanted them to, but some of them are free to vote as they like. At the National Convention, the delegates meet up with the superdelegates who represent the best interests of the party, and together they make the final decision on who will be the nominee for president. Tired? Don't be, because only now does the race for the presidency begin.
Thanks for that, CP Gray. In case he went too fast for you, basically each political party in each state, both the Republicans and Democrats, get to decide on whether or not they're going to have a primary or a caucus. A primary is like a literal election where you cast a ballot, and a caucus is kind of more informal where people might literally change sides of the room to indicate who they're supporting. Despite their differences, the purpose of a primary and caucus remain the same: for a certain party to get together and vote on who their favorite candidate is to win their party's nomination and actually run for president against the other party in the general election. Now, when it comes to primaries, some states will have closed primaries where only registered members of a particular party can vote in their party's primary. And then there are open primaries where anyone from any party can vote in any party's primary. And then there are some states like Ohio, for example, that are semi-open or semi-closed, somewhere in between. When you go to vote in a primary in Ohio, you will approach the desk where you would show your ID, and then they will ask you, what ballot would you like? Republican, Democrat, Green Party, whatever parties are allowed to have a primary in the state of Ohio at the time. And then you tell them which party you want, and then they will give you a card that will allow you to vote in that particular party's primary. And you'll see all of the candidates that are running for the nomination of that particular party. Now, this is where things can get tricky, because you might have a Democrat request a Republican ballot, and then they'll vote in the Republican primary for who they think the weakest candidate is going to be, or someone that they think is for sure going to lose. And a Republican could do the same thing by requesting a Democratic ballot and then voting in the Democratic primary. And there were actually quite a few Democrats that did this in 2016 when they chose a Republican ballot and voted for Donald Trump because they thought there was no way on earth he was going to win. Yeah, that backfired. But if you're worried about a candidate that's too extreme, maybe getting the other party's nomination, then maybe even sometimes you want to jump into the other party's primary and cast a vote for someone you think is more moderate, someone you wouldn't be quite as afraid of if they ended up winning the presidency. But you can really only do that whenever you're confident that your person is going to win, or if your party doesn't have a primary that spring because maybe they already have the presidency and that president's getting ready to run again, so they've already got the party's nomination. So jumping into the other party's primary and playing some political strategy there is something you can do in the state of Ohio, and it's actually something I've done myself before. Anyway, as CP Gray said in his video, states will fight with each other to try to get at the front of the line and have their primaries and caucuses as early as possible, and usually that's going to start around February of the election year. Why do they want to go first? Well, they get a lot of attention if you go first because the candidates want to do really well in your state. If they do well in the first few states that have primaries and caucuses, that's usually a good sign for their campaign because they have the most competition at that point in the race. There's still like 15 to 20 candidates perhaps. And if they're doing well within a broader field, that's a good thing. The states that unfortunately get stuck at the bottom of the pecking order for primaries and caucuses often don't have a lot of candidates still running by the time the election comes around to them, because as some candidates start to see that they're not doing well in a lot of states, they'll drop out of the race entirely. Luckily for us, Ohio typically has their primaries in March on Super Tuesday, which is when a lot of states decide to have their primaries and caucuses. It's usually around this time that a field that started with maybe 15 to 20 candidates running for the Democratic nomination or the Republican nomination drop out, because if they see they're not doing well on Super Tuesday, they know they don't have much of a chance to win the delegate count come June or July. So if you want to run for president someday, obviously after you first check the requirements to make sure you're constitutionally eligible to run, and then you survive the primaries and caucuses, the next step would then be the convention. Most of the time, by the time the convention rolls around, we know who is going to win the nomination for each party. There might be one candidate that has a long shot that's still in the race, but it's usually around the summertime. We know who it's going to be, but we're just going through the motions of having the delegates show up, and each party will have a big convention center that they buy out, and all of these delegates from across the country will gather together and have like a big party. So in the sense that you have a bunch of delegates from the states getting together, and some of the super delegates can actually change their mind and not vote with the state, yeah, it's kind of like the Electoral College in that sense, but it's just far less formal than the Electoral College is. But the conventions kind of have that party atmosphere because they're trying to get people pumped up and ready to get out and vote and campaign for their person. They'll bring in politicians and celebrities that come and give speeches trying to encourage people to vote what's called straight ticket. That means for all of the candidates running in a particular election, you're going to vote for all the candidates of that particular party. And to be honest, that's probably what a lot of you are going to end up doing when you go and vote. You'll vote for someone just because they have an R or a D next to their name. It's not something that I necessarily encourage. But if you really do believe in a party's ideals, then I suppose it makes sense, but do still try to make sure you do your research on individual candidates. I recall one gentleman I talked to who told me a story about his grandmother who was interviewed outside of the polling location, and she said she was going to vote for a candidate that had been accused of drinking and driving and then leaving his passenger for dead after he crashed the vehicle. And she said she was still going to vote for him because he had a D next to his name. And she said, he's a Democrat, ain't he? Yeah, so don't be that person. But when you hear some of these speeches that are given at the convention, it's hard not to fall prey to some of the rhetoric, which I mean really does kind of pump you up. Here's some highlights from the Republican and Democratic national conventions from 2016. The last year we had a normal convention year.
Vote your conscience, vote for candidates up and down the ticket who you trust to defend our freedom and to be faithful to the Constitution.
Vote for the candidate who can't be bought, sold, purchased, bribed, coerced. Vote for the one candidate who does not need this job.
Donald Trump is right. We are at war with radical Islamists. We are losing the war, and we must change course to win the war. Every American should be terrified at the prospect of a Hillary Clinton presidency.
Donald is not really a plans guy.
He never tells you how he's going to do any of the things he says he'll do. He just says, believe me.
He's trying to tell us he cares about the middle class. Give me a break. That's a bunch of malarkey.
He's betting that if he scares enough people, he might score just enough votes to win this election. And that is not the America I know. The America I know is decent and generous. And the American dream is something no wall will ever contain.
There's only one person in this race who will be there, who's always been there for you, and that's Hillary Clinton's life story.
Hillary Clinton and I are compañeros de alma. We share this basic belief: do all the good you can and serve one another.
And tonight, I ask you to do for Hillary Clinton what you did for me. I ask you to carry her the same way you carried me, because you're who I was talking about 12 years ago when I talked about hope. Hope in the face of difficulty. Hope in the face of uncertainty. The audacity of hope. America, you've vindicated that hope. And now I'm ready to pass the baton and do my part as a private citizen. I'm asking you to join me to reject cynicism and reject fear, and to summon what is best in us to elect Hillary Clinton as the next president of the United States.
Now, it's also the National Convention that the candidate that wins the party's nomination will then choose who their vice presidential running mate is going to be.
I accept your nomination to run and serve as Vice President of the United States of America. When Donald Trump becomes President of the United States of America, the change will be huge.
What a tragic end to that love story. Now, as I've said before, presidents will often try to pick a vice presidential running mate that completes them, that kind of appeals to maybe a certain group that candidate's not doing superbly well with or wants to try to court to vote for them. For Donald Trump, that was Mike Pence, who was very popular with evangelical Christians. For Joe Biden, that was Kamala Harris, who was very popular with women of color and women in general. So the convention is kind of a party that unifies everyone within that particular political party and then shifts the focus from kind of fighting amongst each other for the nomination to now focusing on the other side and the other party, because now it's general election time. When presidential candidates are fighting amongst other candidates within their own party, oftentimes they're going to take more extremist views, maybe farther left or farther right, because they're trying to win the support of everyone on the left if you're a Democrat, or everyone on the right if you're a Republican. That's why oftentimes you'll hear Republicans sound more libertarian during primary season, and you'll hear more Democrats sound a little bit more progressive or socialist during primary season as well. But once it comes time to focus on the general election, those candidates will often have to moderate their views and become more in the middle of the political spectrum. Now, they might choose a vice presidential running mate that's a bit farther to the right or a bit farther to the left than they themselves are, because they know that they're going to have to become more moderate themselves, and maybe they're hoping that their vice presidential running mate can at least appeal to those groups to still vote for them and not vote for a third party. But wait, Mr. Lucas, why would a candidate change their views more to the middle if maybe having more extremist views help them win the party's nomination? That's a great question, and that can be answered by the median voter theorem. It's a fancy term for a theory that tries to explain why candidates tend to moderate their positions closer to the middle come general election time. Let's take a look at this chart, and don't be afraid, because no, I'm not introducing math into government right now, but this chart has X and T's on it. The X represent voters and T equals the tax rate policy that those voters favor. The higher the number, the higher the tax rate policy. And let's imagine a theoretical scenario where President Trump runs up against Senator Bernie Sanders for an election. So if in the upcoming U.S. presidential election, President Trump promises T2, tax policy 2, and Senator Sanders promises T5, voter X3 will vote for Trump because voter X3 likes T2 more than T5 because it's closer to their preference. Hence, T2 will win in that pairing. If Sanders is self-interested and he wants to get elected, he will then move his tax policy to T4, thereby countering Trump. Trump, if he is self-interested and wants to get elected, will move even closer to T3, and so will Sanders. Both politicians will move towards the median point in pursuit of an electoral win. Yeah, Mr. Lucas, that seemed way too complicated. Can you explain that again in simple terms? Yeah, sure. Okay, so basically, when there's a general election, that means like everyone in the country of all parties, including independents and those that are moderate that might go between parties, are voting in the election, which means in order to appeal to everyone, you kind of have to moderate your position. If you look at the middle of this chart, tax policy 3, right smack dab in the middle, encompasses all of the voters from X1 to X5. So that means that is the policy that every voter could maybe at least get behind. Maybe it's not ideal, it's not the perfect policy they want, but they'll still vote for someone that has T3. But if you go way out to the extreme, like a really high tax rate like T5 or a really low tax rate like T1, you're going to lose out on some voters. Now, it should be noted that this is a theory, and there are people that dispute the median voter theorem because they note that this leaves out the whole concept of third parties. Because if a candidate moderates too close to the middle, then someone on the fringe that may have agreed with them at like T5 or T1 may say, you know what, I'm actually going to vote for a third party, someone that actually holds my beliefs and values. Yeah, not to mention, if you get too close to the middle and people can't really tell a difference between you and the other candidate, they may just not go out and vote because they'll be like, well, it doesn't really matter. We're pretty much going to get the same person no matter who wins the election. That's why I said last week the parties like to emphasize the differences they do have to really show you that there is a choice. And if you don't vote for our candidate and you get the other guy, things are going to be really bad. So the median voter theorem can kind of help explain why the Democrats don't like extremists like Bernie Sanders and go out of their way to try to make sure he doesn't win the nomination, and why the Republicans don't like people like Ron Paul, who are farther to the right, more libertarian, and went out of their way to try to make sure he didn't get the nomination. Pretty crazy. Two polar opposites had something in common. But like I said, moderating too much does run the risk of creating an environment full of political apathy or people not really caring because they don't see much of a difference between the two parties. And there is some evidence that Americans are kind of politically apathetic. A lot of Americans lack something called political efficacy, which is the belief that you can actually make effective political change. If you don't think you can actually help change the system, then you're less likely to participate in it. You just kind of have a pessimistic view of government and don't think really anything you do is going to change anything. This is particularly prevalent amongst younger Americans who don't vote at the same rates that older Americans do. When it comes to elections, typically those with higher socioeconomic statuses, which is a measure of an individual's wealth, income, occupation, and educational attainment, vote at higher rates than those who don't have quite as much money. When it comes to voter turnout by racial and ethnic identity, we see that white Americans have the highest rates of voter turnout, followed by Black Americans, Asian Americans, and then Hispanic Americans, who have the lowest rate of going out to vote. When it comes to voter turnout and gender, typically women actually vote at a higher rate than men do. So in summary, the people that go out and vote the most in elections are white, typically female, and have higher socioeconomic statuses, meaning they have more wealth and educational attainment. Oh yeah, and they're older. As for why it's that way, well, that's a question political scientists are still trying to figure out. Is age the biggest factor? Is gender the biggest factor? Is wealth the biggest factor? Or are how citizens make voting decisions a big factor in whether or not they vote? When it comes to how citizens make voting decisions, political scientists have kind of narrowed it down to 4 theories. There's rational choice voting, which is where voters are going to vote for someone that they believe is going to further their own best interest. And if there's not a candidate that does that, then they probably are not likely to vote. Then there's retrospective voting, which is where the voter is going to look for someone that has a really good past performance. They have a good track record. They're an incumbent that's been in office before and they have experience. Then there's prospective voting, which is where a candidate might promise to enact certain policies that are favored by the voter in the future, in which case you're putting stock in their promises and what they're going to do. And then there's party line voting, which is also called straight ticket voting. So you'd be voting for candidates who belong only to one political party for all of the offices on the ballot. So regardless of what causes it, it's undeniable that America has a low voter turnout rate. But it's not to say that Americans aren't still involved somehow in the political process. Voting is not the only form of political participation. There are linkage institutions, for example, which are channels that connect individuals with government, including elections, political parties, interest groups, and the media. There's also social movements you can be a part of, and that's where individuals join together to seek political or social change with the goal of placing issues on the policy agenda. Protest, attending political meetings, contacting elected officials, or reaching out to other citizens to educate them are all examples of being part of a social movement and participating in the political process without necessarily voting. In fact, a good chunk of Americans have admitted that they've tried to influence how other people vote. So while Americans don't have high rates of voter turnout, they do talk to people about politics more than most other countries do. So even if you've never voted or ever plan on voting, if you've even talked politics with someone, you have participated in the political process. With that said, the candidates and the political parties still want you to get out and vote because that's really what determines who gets to hold power. So oftentimes political parties and candidates will engage in political mobilization where they try to get out the vote or encourage people to go out and vote. They'll do this through campaign rallies, appearances, holding voter registration drives, creating campaign ads that you hear on TV, the radio, and all over social media. All of this in an effort to get their message across to try to encourage you to go out and vote for them. Any of you that's ever run for a student council election in like grade school, middle school, or even in high school at your home schools, you know how important it is to get your name and your message out there to as many people as possible. Because for some people, it's as simple as, oh yeah, I saw that person had an advertisement up. They said they were going to do this, and I like that, and I'd never heard of anyone else. Plus, and this might sound really strange, but if you see someone's working really, really hard to get elected, it sometimes signals to you that they're going to work really, really hard in office because evidently they care so much about this. You have a soft spot in your heart for the candidates that get up early on a Saturday morning and try to go door to door and talk to each of the voters about what matters to them and what issues they have. When you see a candidate trying to pass out what their message is or try to put up a bunch of flyers and stands all over town, it'll mean more to you when you see a politician take time out of their busy schedule to come visit your town and talk to you and the people like you. Or when a politician takes time out of the day to come talk to a class full of students and answer their questions. All of that stuff will mean more to you than a candidate that just hides in the shadows and never tries to get their message or their name out there for whatever reason. It's almost like if you don't want to put in the effort to try to get elected, why should we hire you to run our public affairs? It's almost like campaigns are a test for the public to see how hard of a worker you are. Of course, all of that from campaign stops, signs, flyers, TV advertisements, radio advertisements, social media advertisements, a campaign manager to make sure all of that's being used effectively and getting to where it needs to go. All of that costs a lot of money. And where do the politicians and political parties get that money from? Well, that's what we're going to take a look at next week. And as we'll see, there's a lot of wealthy individuals and big companies that will spend a lot of money trying to influence how you vote. All right, so here's your assignments for this week. Obviously, you've got this Ed puzzle and then one other Ed puzzle. It's a crash course video on political parties and campaigns. And then there's a Google form I want you to do. That's due by Thursday. And this Google form, speaking of campaigns and campaign advertisements, is going to have you look at some of the most famous campaign advertisements in history. Some of them really good and some of them famous for being hilariously awful. But I want you to analyze each of these campaign advertisements and take a look at what's effective and what's not so effective about these and answer the questions in the Google form. Honestly, it's one of my favorite Google forms that I give students every year because some of these ads are going to be absolutely ridiculous. As always, reach out if you need anything and have a great week.